الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله.
So the aim of this week is to spread awareness about Islam among non-Muslims and in the general community. As SUMSA, we provide student welfare services, and we aim to provide a safe space for all Muslims, and also we run weekly dawah stalls to spread awareness and spread knowledge about Islam just in the university and in the community. So in this panel discussion, we'll be assessing the relevance of religion in a modern society. And we have two outstanding speakers with us tonight. So our first speaker is Brother Uthman Badar, who is a writer, activist, and PhD student of philosophy. He has over a decade of experience in political activism, and he brings a wealth of exposure to discussion. He is also a student of Islamic sciences through multiple traditional teachers and has engaged in many forums and debates on the topics of atheism, secularism, and Islam. So can we please have a round of applause for Brother Uthman? Our second speaker tonight is Dr. Peter Slezak, who is an associate professor in philosophy at the University of New South Wales. His research interests include the history and philosophy of science, language, and the mind. He has been a regular commentator on religion and politics for many years and has engaged in multiple debates and dialogues with notable theists. Can we have a round of applause for Dr. Peter? Thank you. And our moderator for this event is the president of SUMSA, Brother Murad Rafiq. Round of applause. So just before we start the event, the bathrooms are located on level 2. If you go down, the male bathroom is to the right and female bathroom is to the left. Refreshments will be served at 6 p.m. How this event is going to run is basically we have 10-minute presentations from both our speakers, and then we have a moderated panel where we have some interesting and spicy questions for the speakers. And finally, we will open the floor to the audience, and they can ask any questions you guys like. But before we start, I'd like to take a poll. If you could raise your hand if you think religion is still relevant in the society. All right, thank you. All right, so we're just going to take a poll at the end of the event as well and see if you guys change your mind. But without further ado, I welcome Dr. Uthman to take the podium.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. It's fine, it should work. I can't really move around. Thank you, Peter, SUMSA, and everyone in the audience for attending tonight. Only like 10 minutes. I usually start with a few usual, introductory remarks, but I don't think we have time for them in 10 minutes, whilst also trying to solve some very perennial problems. But no, in 10 minutes, I'm just going to try and, throw out some broad framing. I want to try to frame the debate and put out some propositions that we can then, unpack and debate and really interrogate through conversation, through discussion with Peter and then with the audience as well. Now, the question of is religion dead can be understood in a number of ways. I've got two main in my mind. One is more of a descriptive question. Is it still around? Is it growing? Is it waning? Sort of more sociological question, but it can also be asked from with a normative force, that is to say, that whether it's dead or not, should it be buried? Does it really have, do we need it? From that sort of an angle, which is really where I think our focus will be tonight. But I do want to start off with this idea. The idea that religion is dead is quite famously known as the thesis or the theory of secularization in sociology and in other social sciences. And Jeffrey Haddon is an American sociologist, and he was the president of the Southern Sociological Society in the US for a while. He tries to summarize it in concise terms as follows: that once the world was filled with the sacred in thought, practice and institutional form, after the Reformation and the Renaissance of 17th, 18th century Europe, the forces of modernization swept across the globe, and secularization, a historical process, loosened the dominance of the sacred. In due course, the sacred should disappear altogether, except possibly in the private realm. Similarly, Stark and Bainbridge say that the most illustrious figures in sociology, anthropology and psychology have unanimously expressed that their children, or surely their grandchildren, would live to see the dawn of a new era in which, to paraphrase Freud, the infantile illusions of religion would be outgrown. So this is the basic thesis, that modernization and religion, or belief in God or spirituality, have an inverse relationship. Now, something very interesting about this theory, which I wanted to start with, it held a virtual consensus from the mid-19th century well into the 20th century. And we're not talking about some fringe conspiracy theories. We're talking about the preeminent sociologists, anthropologists of the age: Durkheim, Weber, Mill, Marx, Spencer, Siegel, Freud, Comte, Mead. If anything, they agreed. They didn't agree on a lot of things, but if they agreed on one thing, it was this thesis. To the extent that it had paradigmatic status in sociology for over a century. That means that when you come to study related issues, you look at it through this lens. It's that solid. It's that taken as a given. Despite, and this is the point that I want to emphasize, despite the fact, which is brought to light by various scholars, Casanova, an anthropologist, Haddon again, you can check up these references, despite that the theory was neither systematically formulated nor rigorously examined. In other words, it had no rigorous empirical basis. Right? Now, keep in mind, we're not talking about theology from the 15th century or medieval Dark Ages, people coming up with, or Socratic myths. This is 18th, 19th century enlightened sociology. And Haddon says, effectively, it was a sacralized doctrine. A bit of irony there. It was a taken for granted ideology that was orienting sociology as a whole. We'll come back to that. But as I said, I think our focus tonight more is going to be on the normative question. Is there a need for religion? Have we outgrown that need, and not so much the descriptive sociological question, is it still around? Because people can say, atheists can say, well, it's still around, but that's because people won't move on from it. Right? It's their problem. Right? Or it's still around, but so what? Let's talk about whether it should be around. So, when we look at the question from this angle, I'm wondering why they're not. Well, it's all coming up, it's because I haven't done that. So when we ask the question, do we need religion? First of all, the category of religion is a little problematic for me, but we'll use it beyond the scope of the discussion to go down that discussion now. But when I say religion, I mean affirming the existence of God, of transcendence, of something called spirituality, vis-a-vis materiality, or this idea that everything is material. And I obviously answer the question that yes, we do need religion, and in fact I want to argue that the affirmation of God or the Creator alone allows for a coherent and meaningful human experience. Let me qualify that. In accordance to our natural, to human beings, natural disposition, what in the Islamic tradition we call fitrah, and in a way in which we all take for granted. Now what does that mean? It's a bit abstract. To give an example, if I ask the question, what do you guys think about the idea of murdering an innocent 5-year-old child playing in the playground? Everyone would say that's an abomination. That's evil, right? Everyone would agree with that. And so we sort of take that moral judgment as a definitive judgment for granted. It's a given. No one really disputes that, right? And the reason is that we're naturally disposed, inclined towards such conclusion, as with many other moral judgments. However, when I say allowing for a coherent and meaningful human experience, I mean to say that, well, we all say that, all of us atheists, right? But on the atheist worldview, that affirmation is not all that meaningful. It doesn't cohere with the fundamentals of the atheist worldview, as we'll come to see, right? And I'll come back to that point. When I say coherence, I mean, logical interconnection, something. If I make propositions A, B, and C, they could all be true in and of themselves. Do they work together? Do they make sense when I put them together? And that's different from substantiating something, proving that it's actually the case. And I make the decision because I want to argue that the atheist worldview, before I do that, any sort of narrative, any worldview needs to be coherent before we even ask the question of is it true. If it's not coherent, then it doesn't really matter whether it's true or not. Actually, it's an indication that it's probably not true. But it's important for it to be coherent in the first place. And I want to argue that the atheist worldview is not. And when I say atheist worldview, what do I mean? I would argue that the atheist worldview is premised on a number of fundamental propositions, such as the following: science is the only way, or the primary way, depending on which atheist you sort of listen to ascertain truth, that the material natural world is all that exists, the universe either came from nothing or is eternal, or we don't know, but science will tell us at some point. Morals have evolved, they're subjective, but we're still obliged by them, that there are no objective meanings or values in life, we make our own, that religion must be relegated to the private realm. So, the point that I'm making or arguing is that this is not a coherent narrative. For a number of reasons. First of all, proposition number 1 does not carry for itself or for 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. Right? You cannot prove scientifically any of these. So this is the idea. You make a claim, and then you make some other claim, and they don't work together. Likewise, this issue of morals, but we'll unpack this a little bit. So, and I want to focus on 2 particular areas. We could obviously talk about a lot of things, but I want to, in order to focus the discussion, focus on 2 of these. Number 1, the scientism point, and the other issue about morality and, I guess, purpose in life. Well, we could pick any of these, and you do, but the point is, because there's contentions and counter-contentions, I think it's better to focus on a couple than to talk about all of them and not really get anywhere with any one particular. So, quickly on these 2, it's claimed that science is the primary reclusive means to truth. Usually the retort, an accurate retort, I think, is to say that proposition is self-refuting, because you can't prove that very proposition by science. You can't do that. It's a philosophical proposition, and therefore, well, you've contradicted yourself. But I want to go beyond that and say it's not just that. The atheist narrative here misuses or abuses science or instrumentalizes science, and what we end up with is an understanding of science that relies on that which it claims to replace. What do I mean by that? So the story goes something like this. Once upon a time, long time ago, in the in the period of antiquity, before Christianity and before sort of Socrates and the Greek philosophers, there was mythology, and then people started using their minds all of a sudden. By the way, I don't think this theory makes that much sense. It is disputed, but it's quite popular. People started, using their minds more critically at some point, all of a sudden, and we got sort of science, and it develops over time, and we have various theories, and it sort of gets better and better. But the point, the key part of the theory is to go, we have to use science. The only way to ascertain is science. You do the science, you do the observation, you do the experiment, and you follow the evidence. No axioms, no a priori propositions, no the pure, Kantian pure reason, none of that. Do the science. The problem is, you can't begin to do science without axioms, without a priori affirmations, and without some worldview that you bring to the table as you're doing that science. So, for instance, and there's a number of things that are taken to be axiomatic in science, like the principle of causality, like even something very basic, the idea that there's a real world that exists independent of my mind, that there are other minds that exist independent of my mind, right? And a number of other things that I will sure to come upon as we look at. So the point is, you didn't do anything, you sort of went from one mythology, if you want to go by that narrative, to another mythology, on the way that is being defined there. Likewise, when it comes to morality and purpose, I'm being obviously brief and concise here because it's only 10 minutes. And this is again the point about why you can't have a coherent and meaningful human experience and a conception of the world. Morality can, if there's no God, morality can only ever be subjective and instrumental. What does that mean? It's what I make it to be. It's sort of what I say it is. And you're in no position to tell me I'm wrong, because you're just like me, and just like mosquitoes and cockroaches and everything else in the world have just evolved over time and chance and random chemical reactions, from nothing to nothing without any particular purpose. And so there's really no way to establish moral duties or obligation. But because we can't operate without moral duties or obligation, we sort of act in a way as if there is moral duty and obligation. Alright, so murder is wrong. If you do it, you will be punished. But why? Why should I be? Because, you might think that way, but others differ. Alright? And again, we can look at some of this in a bit more. Of course, one of the retorts of this is to come back and say on the issue of meaning and purpose in life. You would have heard this, I don't need God for life to have purpose or meaning. I can make up my own. Well, of course you can, but if you open up a dictionary and go to myth, you're told that it's a noun. That means any invented story, idea, or concept. So if you make up your own meanings and purposes, you engage in mythology. Right? It's not true. Doesn't have objective reality. And so again, the point is, the problem here is in the self-conception of the Western secular atheist tradition. It's this idea that we've moved beyond myth. We're into logos. We're into reason and rationality. But you're not. What you're actually doing is just a different type of mythology. And so, again, what's the point there is the lack of coherence. There's no coherence to the narrative before we come to any issue of substantiation. How about over time? 2 minutes. And so on this point, Kai Nielsen, who's an atheist and a philosopher, a Canadian philosopher, he makes his point quite well about where an atheist cosmology or an atheist ontology, what exists in the world, it will matter, would lead to an ethics logically, right? So he says we have not been able to show that reason requires a moral point of view, or that all really rational persons should not be individual egoists, do whatever you want, or classical amoralists. There's such thing as morals. Reason does not decide here. The picture I painted for you is not a pleasant one. Reflection on it depresses me. Pure practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. But of course, well, not of course, putting my philosopher hat on, but pure practical reason reminds us of Kant, who actually did come up with moral principles based on reason alone, so he claimed. But even Kant, in order for the moral system to work, had to assert things like the soul, an immortal soul, the existence of God, the existence of an afterlife. And for Kant, these things they had to be there. Right? And he smuggles them into his system in the second critique after sort of problematizing them in the first, because for him it doesn't work otherwise. If there's moral obligation but there's no accountability, it doesn't work. Right? And so on and so forth. So this is on the point about morality. I'll probably come back to this later on the time, but the opposite, I wanted to do the same thing. The Islamic worldview is the following, and I argue that it's very much coherent, and obviously it still needs to be substantiated, which are your normal does God exist debates. I think we can come to that on some of the details as we proceed tonight. Thank you very much.
I thank Dr. Uthman for that very intriguing and interesting analysis. I now invite Dr. Peter to the podium.
Thanks very much. Assalamu alaikum. And thanks for the privilege of inviting me to this event. I should say before I get into it, I always like on these occasions, firstly I'm very proud and grateful to be invited on several occasions to debate and engage with the Muslim audience. I feel like saying something before I get into the substance of it that's relevant. I support your goals. I'm glad that you have an Islamic Awareness Week. I think that it's important and necessary to show support for the Islamic and Muslim community. I don't have to tell this audience what a difficult time it is. And I just say, without going into detail on that, I have a particular personal reason for it. I grew up in a Jewish family who were survivors of the Holocaust, and I grew up with the stories of the racism and the prejudice, with understanding what I think now the Muslims are facing around the world, perhaps even on a larger scale. So I feel it's my responsibility to stand and offer my solidarity with the Muslim community. So I'm grateful for these opportunities. So let me get back to the substance of the talk. We've got a lot to talk about and disagree about, and it'll be a good opportunity when we can exchange directly to pick up on several of the points that Uthman has made. Because I prepared my remarks without hearing Uthman, I've made some notes that I'll get back to. But let me just go through the things that I wanted to say, which you'll see do make contact with many of the things that Uthman has said. The topic, as it was described in the advertising, included the question, has religion lost its purpose? And so my first question was going to be, it depends on, firstly, what you mean by religion, but also, and which religion, but here we're talking about Islam. Of course, there's a lot in common, inevitably, between Islam and certainly the monotheistic religions, Christianity and Judaism. But the other question, which is important, part of this sorting out, is what do we mean by purpose? Which purpose could religion fulfill? I put my hand up when the question was asked, is religion still relevant or is it dead? Well, clearly, as Uthman said, in a descriptive sense, clearly it's not. But the normative question, what is its function, what is its role, what is its purpose, is something I want to address. So to take two large categories in regard to its purpose, the obvious one to address, and came up in Uthman's talk about naturalism and science. Inevitably, one has to talk about the place of religion, any religion, in the light of the advance of science, and Uthman made some remarks about that, and I often talk about that. The best way I can address this, as I often do, is to draw attention to a famous distinction that was made and a way of reconciling religious claims and religious life with science. The attempt to reconcile it, I think, is important and inevitable. One way, I have to say, I've got Muslim friends that I admire and I'm very fond of, who will show me that not only the Quran, the sacred Quran, but also other texts, Christianity and the early Jewish texts, they claim that they have anticipated a lot of modern science, and you can find, if you look carefully, that much of modern science can be read in these texts. I frankly don't believe that. I have to confess I haven't done a close study of this, and I owe it to my Muslim friend who gave me a book on this to look at that more carefully, so I reserve my judgment, but I think it's very unlikely. In any case, the fact is that science has made enormous strides for whatever reason, and the question of the conflict, or at least the, you might say, irrelevance of religion when it comes to understanding the world, is difficult to contest. In any case, the enterprise of science, for all its weaknesses and failings, is spectacularly successful in understanding the natural world. That simply can't be denied. And that's a function of the term which Uthman used, which I think is the appropriate one, is naturalism. The question is, what do you mean by naturalism? We can disagree about that, but let me say quickly what I think it is and what it's not. It's not some metaphysical proposition. It's simply the endorsement of our best current theories. The only thing, other than our best current theories, are worse ones. If you have a particular current theory of chemistry or biology or economics, there are better and there are worse. And there's a simple, more or less uncontroversial definition of what science is, and a naturalistic attitude. Many theologians I've read and debated with want to claim that you have some kind of choice, that there's a metaphysical choice. You can choose a theistic metaphysics. By the way, when anybody uses the word metaphysics, you should be very suspicious. It's not clear what that means. I've got a much simpler view. It's not a choice of metaphysics. You don't have a choice. You've either got better theories and you've got worse ones. Sometimes you can't tell. But science is simply trying to improve our theories, and we can very often tell when you have a better one and when you have a worse one. That's the history of science. And it's not always clear. Okay. So there's this question of science, and I have to say, in terms of its irrelevance, whether it's become outmoded, one of the important points too is that religion did, certainly Christianity and Judaism at least, and probably Islam, the distinction between science and religion wasn't that clear in the earliest periods. The source of knowledge was undoubtedly the texts which people took seriously. I know better the Western history, and I was going to mention Galileo, who famously made the distinction when it started to become clear that the Christian Bible, in that case, and the Jewish texts, he said, could not be and should not be regarded as science textbooks. They have a different function. And he helped the Church, the Catholic Church, compromise between the science as it was evolving and the claims that you might find in the holy texts. And his point was that the scriptures were not meant to be a science textbook. He said their purpose was different. Their purpose was to guide your life for the question of faith and morals, but not to tell you science. Now, I think that's inevitably, perhaps for an atheist, that I think is an appropriate attitude. And we look to our best science. In the time left, let me perhaps say something quickly. I'm running out of time quickly. The question of morality. It's rather paradoxical. Uthman put up a statement that the affirmation of God alone allows for a coherent and meaningful existence. Of course, that implies that my life, as he kind of intimated, an atheist life, therefore, somehow must be meaningless. Now, I think that's absurd, frankly. My life is not meaningless because I don't happen to believe in a certain theory, which I think has little, or I would say no, support. That's a belief in a God and whatever follows. And then the question comes, what kind of meaning there is. Now, since I'm quickly out of time, let me indicate two senses in which the meaning can be understood. The one very big question, again, which Uthman touched on, is the question of morality. It's a fair question, where did your ethics come from, if not from a holy text? Of course, even if it comes from a text, there's the question of interpretation, and that has to be humanly understood, and there's always debate about how to understand the text. But if you don't have the text as a kind of a holy book and a sacred source, you have to answer the question of morality in some other way. Now, we haven't got time, and I certainly haven't got time to tell you how moral philosophers, not believers, but atheist moral philosophers, as you put up one example on the screen, try to make sense of this. It's not trivial and it's not easy. I don't want to say that it is. By the way, I made a note on the quote that you gave from one philosopher who said something. He said, reason does not decide here. That's actually not a very good way to put it. Reason does decide, but the facts don't decide. There's the difference. Morality can be based on reason, as it is, as mine is, as an atheist reason. The reasons are different. They're to do with living communally. I can give you a quote, my favourite quote from Bertrand Russell I have somewhere. He said, the good life is one inspired by love and guided by knowledge. That's a good shorthand for how you find your morality. And I have a nice quote, if I can quickly read it. It comes from somebody who said that everything you know about morality you learned in kindergarten. You know, play fair, share with the other kids, don't hit the other kids, say you're sorry when you hurt someone, clean up after yourself, and don't take things that don't belong to you. You don't need a holy text for these sorts of things. This is a guide in life that we all have to learn. So there's an answer to that. But finally, the other question, which is relevant and raised in an atheist's worldview, is what is the meaning of life? Now, that's an odd question because, again, it's hard to imagine that all of the atheists don't have a meaning in their life. So if you ask what is the meaning of my life, it comes from within my life, from all of the things that I value, the things that I enjoy, the things that make my life rich and enjoyable and sometimes not so enjoyable. So the simple answer to the question is that the fullest meaning of one's life comes not from somebody else outside, another entity or another being or another intelligence. And I think that's true of everybody. You may think that your meaning comes from somebody, but that's fine. But it doesn't have to, and a rich life can come from within and from the purposes that we have, to the extent that your ambitions are fulfilled and your pleasures are real. Bertrand Russell put it nicely. He said, pleasures and happiness is no less real if it comes to an end. I happen not to believe in a life after death, but my life doesn't lose its meaning because of that. It's kind of a dark, odd reflection that human beings can come to. We're not like the cockroaches. We have a big difference. We have a very powerful mind and we can reflect and think about things. And let me end on Galileo's insight. He said, when he's talking to the Catholic Church, he wrote a famous letter to try to explain how to reconcile science and religion. He said, look, the God that gave us the scriptures, the holy texts, also gave us the mind that we use to understand the world. They can't be in conflict. You should not repress or overrule your intelligence and your thinking in order to... That's my timer, I think. Yeah. How do I turn anything off? Was that somebody else bugging? Excuse me. Let me finish my sentence. Galileo's point was you should not override your senses, your eyes and your ears and your intelligence, because God also gave us, if you believe in God, the capacity to use it, and therefore that's a way of reconciling religion and atheism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Peter, for that very mesmerizing and enchanting analysis. Now we're headed on to our panel, and I'll hand it off to Brother Murad, and he'll be taking it from here.
Okay, just a quick explanation of how this is going to work. We are going to be taking questions throughout the panel, so if you do have, please raise your hand and I'll take them when necessary. As well, there is an option to message me if you want your questions to stay anonymous. Okay, I'll start off. Yes, sure.
Testing one.
Okay, I'll start off with a quote by philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. He said, "I don't know why we are here, but I'm pretty sure that it is not in order to enjoy ourselves." So, following on from Dr. Peter's last remarks about the meaning of life and we giving ourselves purpose and full meaning, do you think that religion has any part in that, or should the individual? Open to both. Do you think religion has any part in that, or should individuals be the deciders of that?
Look, there's obviously a number of options, but if I might take this back to the point that I was making and expand on it, you can come up with your own meanings. Obviously, you make things up. The point is, what does that mean? What does it amount to? Right? And so I think when Peter was sort of saying, kindergarten morality, say sorry, and the rest of it, or that, I have a meaning in life, sure. I don't doubt that Peter and other atheists have meanings. But the point is not the people, it's the idea. It's the idea. When I say that, morality is simple, just clean up after you say, sorry, I'm just repeating a proposition. It's to say, if I say X is immoral, murder is immoral, for instance, that's the proposition. But the question is not, do you agree with that? We're starting off on the premise, we both agree. The question is why? The question is, where does that gain its normative force from, its moral force? Where does it get its moral obligation from? And how does that cohere, make sense, in your overall framework? Right? And so it doesn't help us here to repeat and say, yeah, murder is wrong, I believe it's wrong as well. So do you. Be good people. Love, have meaning. It's much more specific than that. It's about showing why on the atheist narrative, on the atheist view, however many particular atheists, and again, I don't believe in this idea that atheists can't be moral. I think that's a conflation of two different arguments. It's wanting to suggest that atheists can't be moral. It's something else to say that on the atheist worldview, morality doesn't have a coherent grounds, right? And so I'm arguing the latter, not the former. And so it's the question, to put it more pointedly, is where does moral obligation come from? What's the grounds for saying that murder is wrong, apart from you just saying, yep, that's what I feel, that's what I agree with, which would be entirely subjective, which is my point.
Can I come back and say, look, it's not as simple as that and crude as that. It's not just what I feel. And I have to refer to the vast literature on attempting to explain how morality works for other reasons than a belief in a God or in a holy text. There are good reasons. That's why I said it's wrong for that fellow to say reason doesn't decide. The facts, science doesn't decide, because the facts don't tell you what ought to be. Facts are descriptive. This is a famous distinction again by David Hume, who distinguished is from ought. So the question is, where do you get your ought from? But let me turn the tables. Okay, so you think you have an objective basis for morality, which comes from the Quran, which comes from God, but you have to justify that. That's not true just because you said so. I mean, you have to convince me. I'm the atheist. So the fact that you have an authority, and even if God exists, and you have some reason to believe that he gives you certain rules for life, that can be open to question. It's not because somebody else tells you what to do. It doesn't make it right. I mean, perhaps because God created the whole universe. I mean, you can tell the theological metaphysics about that. But you see, it's very unpersuasive for me that right comes because somebody told you so. It seems to me I mean, I guess I'm having trouble thinking about what it must feel like if you think that God is the creator, therefore you must do whatever he says. The other, if I could, while I've got the microphone, pick up a point that you made that's relevant to this. You referred to natural dispositions and the notion of a fitra. But that cuts both ways, because natural dispositions don't necessarily give you good ways to behave. Famously, in the Western tradition, Thomas Hobbes wrote a book called The Leviathan, and he said if we're left to our natural dispositions, the society is a mess. Famously, he talked about the state of nature, in which life is nasty, brutish, and short. The whole point of morality, the whole point of society, is to govern our natural instincts, because otherwise we steal and cheat and rape and murder and do all sorts of stuff. So it's not clear just to point to human nature, because human nature, as I think we all know, is not necessarily on its own a guide to the way we should live. There are other reasons, as that fellow mistakenly denied. The reasons are we have to cooperate, we have to live together happily, we have to get on partly out of self-interest. So there are answers. We can't in the short time give you the whole history and the doctrines of morality that are not based on God, but they're based on reason. And in fact, one version, let me just say, is utilitarianism, which means roughly not just my happiness, but a commitment to the happiness of people generally.
There was a few things there. You might start right at the end there. I mean, I said at the start that morality on the atheist view would be, I said, subjective and instrumental. That's exactly what you're saying when you say that. It's pragmatic, right? Functional is what I mean by instrumental. We sort of say, well, if everyone did not kill other people, things would not be all that well, so let's not do it, right? But the problem should be obvious, right? It's like, okay, we all agree with that, but someone disagrees. Who are we to tell him he's wrong? That's the question. It's like, all we can say is, look, don't do it because things aren't going to work out. That's all you can say. You can't say you're evil. Where does the concept of evil come from? It's just a pragmatic setup that we agree to. And so I'm not denying that you can't come up with moral propositions, outside of the theistic framework based on reason. You can, utilitarianism and all sorts of other things, but this is what they will amount to. Subjective judgments that are instrumental in the end, and that's it. So I might say, whatever works for the greater good for the greater number of people, and then Hitler comes along and says, well, I think the greater good is to kill off all these other people. And I can disagree, and he can disagree, but in the end, how can I say to him, what you're doing is evil, is the question.
Going backwards, because the first question I asked you was, okay, I get your idea that you have to have some absolute answer. The atheist can't give you one. There isn't one. You're right. So you have to have another answer. No. Yeah, that's it. That's the nature of moral judgment. Animals don't have it. Planets. I mean, morality is a construction. There's no question about that. I don't think that's open to debate. I agree. You, the believer, has to explain why you believe in a God, because then you can't go the other way. You can't say morality proves there's a God because you can't find any basis for it. It's got to go the other way around. You've got to say it's because you believe in a God that you get your morality, and then you owe an answer, and then we have to get back into the belief in God. It has to go in that direction, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that.
You agree with that? Yeah.
I have a question from the audience to Peter. Is incest with protection morally wrong?
Goodness me, what a question to ask. Incest, you mean with contraception?
Yes.
That's too hard to answer, glibly. I gather the reason for the question is that that's generally regarded as wrong and inappropriate. I imagine some moral philosophers might say that it's acceptable for various reasons. Look, that's really not a fair question to ask. It depends on too many things. For example, let me be a bit provocative and say, if it's between two cousins that don't even know they're cousins, is that wrong? I mean, you could make up all sorts of stories. You can't do moral philosophy in such a glib way. You've got to give it a serious, detailed discussion, and so it's not fair for me to say anything, off the cuff about something like that. Like most moral questions, that's a difficult case, and so that's perhaps why it was asked. It's a fair question. That's like asking, is murder always wrong? I'm not a pacifist. I can think of cases where killing people is justified morally. So there's no blanket answer to that question, as there isn't in morality. Again, to go back to our conversation, you have to think about things. You haven't got a set of pre-prepared, prefabricated rules. They have to be based on rationality and a lot of other values. So I'm sorry I can't, go into a long, detailed answer to that question because I don't think there's a clear answer to it.
theist, but I just wanted to put the question back onto specifically, if I recall correctly, it was more about how like religion essentially gives a purpose within this existence. And the answer was provided that it was for morality. But is that specifically like Islam would have a relevance in giving people meaning and a purpose within existence, as opposed to just a more Western conception of life?
That's a good question. I didn't say that, or at least I didn't intend to say that purpose was morality. There were two separate points. Morality points, I was picking out 2 or 3 aspects of the atheist narrative and I was critiquing. To answer the question more positively, in positive terms, the purpose of life, well, the link between the two, and there is one, is the difference between objective meanings or judgments that come from God, as opposed to subjective meanings or judgments that we make ourselves, whether we enforce them by force or we don't, is a separate question. But the point is this: our purpose in life is not just moral, and I'm not talking about the content even of what it is. I'm talking about, and this is why on Peter's point about substantiation, belief in God and moving in that way, I agree with that. But this is why I distinguish between substantiation and coherence. I'm at an earlier stage. I want a coherent narrative whose substantiation we can entertain. Because if it's not coherent, why should we entertain claims about substantiation in the first place, right? So the purpose of life is broader than that. In Islam, the purpose of life is reverential servitude or service of God, of fellow humanity, and a number of things that will fall within that. That's a very broad level. But again, I'm not looking at the content here per se. It could be anything. The point in the end is tied to whether it's true or not. And that's tied to the question of whether it's coherent and whether it's substantiable, whether I can substantiate it with evidence or proof or not.
Well, look, I haven't got a lot to say. I mean, about that. The question of coherence is odd to me. I'm not sure what's incoherent in a strict logical sense from an atheist point of view or from the atheist's doctrine. I think it's very coherent, and I think it's true. The one thing of coherence, I was just looking at my notes where you mentioned something about how certainly the naturalistic view, I think you included in this incoherent picture because it starts with axioms. I don't think that's correct. I mean, I'm sure it's not correct. Science doesn't start with axioms at all. In fact, the paradox of our understanding of science is that everything is open for re-examination and refutation and change and revision. That's one of the interesting understandings of science, that we actually are not committed to anything. We can revise the most fundamental principles. Causality, doesn't matter what you think, they've all been overthrown, in fact, which is what has been interesting about the history of science. In fact, just to quote a reference, one of the foremost philosophers of science, Willard Van Orman Quine at Harvard, explained how science has to be understood. He gave an analogy. He said, our broad conceptual scheme, our understanding of the world is like a boat that we're sailing in. We have to fix it. We can take any part of it, we can take any plank and replace it. We can't just sink it while we're at sea, but it's all open for being rebuilt. So there's nothing in our scientific framework that's not open to revision. That's the virtue of science. It's changeable. We change our minds about the most fundamental things which we never thought we would. So that's its strength. Because when we find out we've got a better theory, we adopt the better theory and we chuck away the other one.
Yeah, I think for me, that's part of the incoherence of the narrative. It sounds good on the face of it, but it doesn't really stand to interrogation. So, let's take the boat, right? So you get on this boat, it's got planks. The point is, you can't begin sailing. You can't begin moving on the water without these planks. And so if I start sailing and then I want to remove a few of the planks because they're problematic, I end up in this problem. So to use a concrete example, if I start off with the assumption, this is why there are axioms, of causality. There's an assumption. If I do any experiment, I apply heat to some liquid and it boils at a particular degree, I assume that one caused the other. I don't assume that?
Look, forget the boat analogy. It's a metaphor.
All right.
Science has abandoned causality is no longer a fundamental principle of science. Einstein didn't like it, by the way, but quantum theory and the nature of the Copenhagen interpretation, which is maybe open to dispute. And I'm not a physicist here, we're in the physics building, we should get somebody in here, but it's a simple, uncontroversial question. Causality is no longer the fundamental principle of science.
But you're jumping, that's not the point. I'm asking, let's start with the first point. When I see the water boiling, or the liquid, at 100, am I not assuming that the fire, the application of the heat to the liquid has caused the water? Am I not assuming that?
You could be right.
Well, that could be right. Of course I'm assuming that, otherwise nothing would work. Otherwise
I
I'd
don't
go,
see what follows.
well, that happened today.
No,
but
come on. You started off
it happened
saying that
100
there are some
times.
Sorry, go on.
So, if I don't assume that, axiomatically, a priori, I cannot begin with science.
It's not a priori. It's a principle which is an empirical claim. Let's say we have some theory which we are committed to. It's part of the scientific framework. Some things are foundational in science, there's no question about it. But they're all revisable. There's nothing, you seem to want to depend on showing that some things are commitments that we can't change.
No, I'm not saying that.
Oh, okay.
An axiom doesn't mean that it's not revisable, but you're starting out on that basis. And so you're starting out with something that's non-scientific.
You don't use the term axiom in science, that's from mathematics. So, in science there's nothing that's axiomatic in that technical sense. It's not, they're theories which have empirical foundation. So these are, maybe we're not disagreeing so much. Science has commitments. And if you agree that they're all revisable, that's fine.
I think in theory they're revisable, but it's part of the problem. When I revise causality through a method that relies on causality, I'm in a problem. It should be obvious. Because whatever I've proven that questions causality for me is only been proven because I've assumed it in the first place. And so,
Science is not
but that's not my
circular.
point. My point is just that there are extra scientific, pre-scientific commitments without which you cannot begin science. Generalization, universal, natural laws. How can you come up with an idea of natural laws?
You find things which seem to be deserving of the status of universal generalizations, and you find out they're sometimes not. Then you...
Okay, no, but hang on a minute. I see something happen once, twice, 3 times, 10 times, 100 times. At what point does it become universalizable? I should just say, I saw it happen 100 times.
No, that's called induction.
Oh, 101.
Yeah, that's how science works. You could be wrong. You make an assumption, and you could find out that it's wrong.
That's the point.
That's the standard literature on confirmation theory and how you decide what is a universal generalization. It's based on limited evidence. So in other words, you can only ever have a limited finite amount of evidence, and you make an assumption that maybe this whole... Isaac Newton's laws, he only saw a relatively small number of things. He came up with laws which he claimed were universal gravitation for everywhere in the universe. Okay, well, that turned out to be pretty good.
But that's what I'm saying. It's an assumption, and it's not scientific.
That's all it is. It's all only ever an assumption. That's the point of science.
But so there's a commitment.
But an assumption is a temporary commitment. Everything's provisional. Let me use that word. Everything is provisional.
Can we
should move on.
Yeah, can we bring it back to why is science actually important and what is the relevance to religion?
I should answer.
Science is important.
Why is science important is the question. And what is its relevance to religion? That's a tough one to answer. I mean, I can't give an answer because even though I'm not a believer, I think religion does have a place. I didn't say a lot about that. That's what we want to say. Why is science important? Let me just give a quick kind of summary of why I think science is important. I've said this the other day. Science is our best refined understanding of what it is to be rational, what it is to believe rationally, to use reason, like the guy said. And in fact, it goes beyond science because for many philosophers, it's actually a model of how you run your life outside of science, in the case of reasoning about anything, about life, morality. It's a refinement of rational thinking, and it relies on logic and what follows, and on evidence and principles, which we are all, I mean, maybe a fitra, more or less naturally inclined, but it doesn't prevent us making mistakes. So over the centuries, the history of science has been the refinement of our capacity to understand things by pursuing the methods of science. Science here is a shorthand for rational belief, and we've refined it to the point where we've been able to bootstrap ourselves beyond what even intuitively seems right. Up to Galileo, people thought heavy things fall faster than light ones. That seems obvious. It turns out common sense is wrong, but we've been able to bootstrap ourselves beyond what is obvious to now very unobvious things that are overwhelmingly established. So that's the answer. Science simply is the best method for rational thinking we have. We don't have anything better, and it doesn't depend on anything as it were, outside itself. It's just a pragmatic a tool which has proved itself, and it's the best we've got.
Okay, and you're saying you're saying religion is relevant.
I mean, Uthman and I probably agree to some extent on this. I think religion clearly serves a purpose for people's lives. While I don't accept, as I mentioned, the factual statements, I think Islam, I think Christianity and others have moral principles which I can admire and agree with. I think they're important foundations, and for many people they are a guide to life, and I have no problem with that, and I probably agree with a lot of it. I should be better informed about Islam, and I'm trying to be, and certainly even about my own religion. I'm an atheist and I was never particularly committed to my own religious background. But I admire the guide to life that religion gives, and so while it's not for me and it's not for everybody, it has a place. I mean, I can think of other examples where the great works of literature, both in the Islamic tradition and works of art and architecture, the inspiration that it provides for people is unquestionable. The magnificent works of art in all the traditions, the buildings and the art, I love all that stuff. And I think it's fair to say that without that kind of inspiration, perhaps it wouldn't have been possible. This may not be satisfying or enough if you're a believer, but there's no question about its magnificence. And I have no problem with that. And even science, for many believers, in the Catholic tradition, in the Islamic tradition, actually their science was motivated by their religious commitment. I think that's clear in many cases. So I think it has a function, and I don't want to deny that.
Yeah, on the question of the importance of science and then religion, I mean, it's quite, you look at the example of Galileo and Stephen Jay Gould calls it overlapping magisteria, in the way that science and religion can work together. Islamically, I think a lot of the issues, some of these, not all of them, but some of these issues are coming from a Christian background. So this idea that, scientists are repressed in the Islamic tradition, as you know, it's the opposite. So a lot of that baggage, I think, is not helpful. In the Islamic tradition, the sort of the way they cohere science and religion, or empirical observation, empirical study and religion, or the normative, the moral, goes all the way back indigenously to the Prophet himself, right? Where he makes clear that the purpose of revelation is not primarily empirical. Human beings are left to do their empirical studies for themselves. The purpose of religion, primarily, I'm saying, so there are exceptions to that, but primarily is the normative, the moral, the legal, the legislative, to teach you how to conduct yourself, which are the harder questions. So for me, they go together in this very simple way. Empirical observation, empirical investigation, if we can use that term, answers our how questions. How does the world operate? Whether the natural world or the social world, if you want to include the social sciences. But that's where it stops. You can't go from an empirical investigation to an ought, as we've said already. And so a lot of the more fundamental, more important aspects of human life, moral questions, questions of meaning and purpose, questions of politics, how to organise society, are not going to be answered through these empirical studies. And therefore, there is an inevitable need for something like religion, and something that is that goes beyond. And obviously, you can do it. You can try to do it through other means of reason, but we end up at our original discussion where it's just subjective. You're making things up, and people can disagree with you, and you don't really have any way to impress that onto them, except by force.
We'll get to the audience soon. Just, I want to shift away a bit from the science, proving God. Can I ask a question to Peter? How can you expand on how you create your own purpose?
Wow. Well, it goes back to
Saturday morning breakfast.
Again, it depends on what you mean by purpose. Let's leave morality to one side. We've talked about that a bit. I mean, I tried to say something about that. If you ask anybody, they'll give you an answer that isn't based on something that God told them or God said. For most people, I think for everybody, if you ask them what is the meaning of their life, they will tell you the things that they do that they find meaningful, they will say. What do they mean? It makes life enjoyable is too small in some sense. It's not just enjoyable. Sometimes you do things that are not enjoyable that are meaningful. Helping other people, committing yourself to certain causes, often for the nation, for the state. People are often committed to a collectivity, their group, to their football team, for goodness sake. I mean, I can't understand that, frankly. But, you know, people find meaning in their social networks. These are real and they're valuable, and you could give a sort of a whole long story about how within your life the purpose comes from certain commitments and engagements that you have, usually with other people, but not always. Listening to music, art for many people, their personal relationships, their family. I mean, you know, I could think of a whole bunch of stuff, but that's true of everybody. It's very hard to deny that those are the bases for the meaning of one's life. Where in all of this, let's say in my case, does the meaning in any way become diminished because I don't happen to think there's somebody outside for whom my life gets its meaning? I can't see that that would make my life more meaningful. It's somebody else's meaning. It's not mine. Now, if you think that, it may make your life meaningful, because certainly believers see that as part of the meaning of their own life. But that's one belief that gives you meaning, just as any other belief might. So you can't say that that's the only basis for a meaningful life. I have to say, people who are committed, I mentioned examples of nationalism and so on, I think they're one of the more dangerous ways in which people find their meaning. It goes back to a point that Uthman just made. In the end, there isn't any other way to disagree when people have a difference in this, and often people resort to force. And the overwhelming commitment to certain nationalistic, patriotic sentiments gives meaning to life, all right. And I think the world would be a lot better off if we didn't have those particular bases for our meaning. We saw human commonality and shared humanity. Anyway, so, yeah, people find meaning in all sorts of ways, and they're not all good, but they're meanings.
Yeah, just quickly, I'll make a quick point about this inside and outside thing that Peter's sort of come back to a few times. That the meaning comes from outside, or someone tells you. A couple of quick points. First of all, I think there's a tendency in this discourse, particularly from atheists, to be not purposefully, but to be a little flippant about the concept and idea of God. Obviously, I don't believe in it, so you can expect that. And some do it more respectfully, like Peter, than others, as we know. But there is still a flippancy. It's not taking the concept seriously. It's as if God's another person, your boss, you know, someone on the side, so why should they tell you what to do? You should sort of live your own life, right? But it's sort of not taking the proposition seriously, away from whether it's, you know, whether you agree, whether you look at the evidence, and our discussion is valid. But to take the proposition seriously would be not to treat the outside as some sort of third party who just comes along and tells you what to do, and like, why should they tell you what to do, right? It's like your parents and you're sort of rebelling against your parents. If you take the concept seriously, the creator of the heaven and the earth is the one who created everything. He created you, right? And so coming back and adding here the point about follow the evidence, follow the truth, here's where the problem arises. On the one hand, if you accept that proposition about the creator, because they're considering it, separate to the issue of substantiation, then it makes a whole lot of sense to follow what God has legislated, because it's a source of higher knowledge, right? It's a source of not just higher, but infinite knowledge, right? So again, it's not to bypass the substantiation, but it's to say that if you want to consider the proposition, it needs to be considered seriously on its merits for what it happened. And I find this happens a lot. So for example, your problem of evil. How is it fair that, you know, you get an earthquake or natural disasters and all these people die? But you're considering that from your point of view, where limited life, people die, and, you know, 85 years old, came and died and had some disease, and how's that fair? You're not considering it in the actual frame in which it happens, which is an eternal life following this one. And so if you did consider that, I'm not saying you would agree, but the whole equation changes. Now you're asking the question, if a 5-year-old is you know, suffering like this, then to gain eternal bliss, is that fair or unfair? It certainly changes the problematic, right? So it's about, even when we could critique, we need to consider any particular premise within the framework in which it's being made, and I think that sometimes sort of doesn't happen, which I think is what's sort of happening with this inside-outside business, which seems like a priori as well. It's like, it seems a priori like if it's inside it's better, if it's outside it's sort of not.
Now, let me jump back onto this. Look, I want to take seriously, I think you accept that I take seriously, I'm not being flippant. By the way, I didn't dissociate myself like I usually do from the other atheists that You know what I'm talking about.
All of the atheists in the world.
Yeah, no, but you know, Dawkins and Hitchens and Harris, I'm very cross with them, and I think that they don't pay sufficient respect to believers. They're revolting. But let me get back to your point. No, you jump too many steps too quickly. Let's accept that God is the creator of the universe. I mean, I've had this argument with Christian theologians as well, who think that the Big Bang was created by God. Let's accept that. I mean, that's your point, the creator of everything. You put it that way.
Yeah.
Let's take it seriously for the sake of argument. That doesn't get you anything beyond something. In Plato's dialogue with Socrates, he asks a very interesting question. If you accept that God exists and morality comes from God, it doesn't decide which way it goes. Are things good because God said so, or does God say so because they're good? There could be a reason that, and my theologically inclined friends often think of it that way, that things are intrinsically good. That's why God endorses them or commands them. So that's an interesting logical question too. And theologians may differ on that, but it's not simply the existence of God determines what counts as good.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I agree with that. When I say consider it within the full narrative, I'm talking about atheistic framework, and obviously in this case Islam, whether it be Christian or Jewish, which are not just God exists, but God exists, there's revelation, and obviously the whole framework is based on that. But obviously the example stands when, for example, the problem of evil is put forth as a criticism, it's of the whole thing, it's not just of this one premise where there's just a God. Otherwise, yeah, I agree. The framework is complete. God exists, there's revelation, you have to prove that revelation, you can't just take it for granted, you have to prove the existence of God, you can't just take it for granted, and so on and so forth. But I'm just trying to focus in on particular points today, otherwise, as you know, each one of those would be a
Do you agree about that then? Okay, so we agree on that. Again, we haven't got time to go into the full ramifications, but just let me say something specifically. You at least mentioned in passing the problem of evil. The answer that you hinted at is problematic. It turns out to be very difficult for believers to overcome the reality of suffering by essentially excusing it in some way on the grounds of eternal happiness afterwards and balancing it. This is a very big and very problematic literature for believers because it's very hard to deny. I mean, let me state it bluntly, if you don't know the argument. Whether somebody will be happy in eternity afterwards doesn't remove the fact that they may be suffering now. And the question for an omnipotent God and a benevolent, a loving God is, why didn't he just not create the suffering at all? That's a tough one. You don't think so?
No, because life wouldn't be a test. Life wouldn't be a test.
Well, if
Which
God's
the holding
omnipotent,
hand.
why should he give us a test? Let's just make us all happy.
One step at a time. First of all, again, this comes back to the point about taking the proposition seriously. If God is the creator of the universe, and we are part of the product of the universe, he decides what the universe is for, not us. We can think about it, we can come up with and ask, well, is this coherent?
So you're saying you don't really know why he does it, but he did it because he's the
No,
creator.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that he's the creator, and therefore we can ask why questions, but we should know our place in asking those why questions. Otherwise, what we're doing, if we were to subject God to what we think should be the case, what sort of it's just flippant treatment of God. You don't really think he's God. It's just
So we can't we can't think seriously to ask questions about why God would do something this way rather than another way.
No, you can, but
we can't understand it.
No, you can even understand it, but what you can't do is go, it has to be like this.
No, it's a question.
Why did God go like that?
If he loves human beings, why does he make them suffer?
Because
Or animals.
Because there's numerous reasons. Number one, because keep in mind, when we talk about suffering, it's not just a magnitude problem, it's any and all suffering, right? So the slightest amount of suffering will come under that.
Yeah.
I cut my paper cut with my hand, it's suffering, right? And so, if God were, as is the case in most of the theistic traditions, to make life a test for which accountability and reward and punishment is made in the hereafter, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, but why do we have to be tested?
But why does it have to or not have to?
Well, you said
It's a
it. You
decision.
said God is testing us.
Yeah. And you're saying, why does it have to be that? It doesn't,
Why
doesn't have to be that way.
us?
Doesn't
So
have
he
to be
makes
that
us suffer to test us.
way. Yeah.
Well, then he's not being nice to us.
But then you believe that there is God.
I don't.
No, because when you were saying that, it's a personal question rather than scientific. Because when you're saying that, I don't like God because he is making us suffer.
I didn't say I don't
but
like
then
him.
say there is a God, whether it's bad or
I think we'll come back to the Q&A. Come back to the Q&A. I think the point is still it's one of coherence. The problem from the evil argument being made is that there's an incoherent concept of God. You can either be all good or beneficent, or omnipotent, or or omniscient. You can't be all three. That's an argument, right? But this point that you're making about why does it have to be this way, that's not an argument.
No, it's not about God. It's about people who believe three things that can't be reconciled.
That's the argument. But when you make it about why is it like this and not like that,
no, it's why you believe it like this. It's not about God. It's about why you have these beliefs that you think fit together.
because the revelation
Beliefs don't fit together.
No, because that's what the revelation tells us. That's a separate issue.
But the argument is that they're incoherent. The three beliefs that actually are incoherent. Use
Okay.
the word coherence. It's a question of coherence.
Okay. This is the point. If I can give any valid possible reason, then it's not incoherent. And this is the point. When I give those reasons, you're not saying it's still not incoherent. That's not a possible reason. You're saying why does it have to be that way?
Well, you
And
give
so
the
there's
free will defense. You know the story.
There's
You
a
know
sleight,
the
that's a sleight of hand.
Yes.
As long as I can give a valid possible reason,
Yeah.
the incoherence falls apart, and it's this is why they're suffering. There's this reason, there's that reason, there's numerous reasons. Without suffering, you can't have what philosophers call second order good. Can you have courage and bravery without suffering? You can't. We're just all holding hands and going, party all day and night because there's no suffering whatsoever. So there's no courage, there's no growth. There's no growth, right? We all grow through suffering, do we not? So that's just one. There's many reasons, but the point is just one reason is sufficient to say problem was not a problem, right? But then usually this is what happens, like, well, why is it this way? Why is it that way? And there's a number of assumptions that I think shouldn't be there.
Sorry? Louder.
Can you hear me?
No.
Down front? Okay. Alright, so I want to move to a slightly different topic. On the problem of causality, there was a claim made that said that science, modern science, is able to challenge the assumption or postures of causality. With regard to quantum physics, speaking as a postgraduate student in physics, all that's being challenged is non-local causality, which is that in different places causality can be violated, but locally, talking about the same place or the same observer, causality is still a postulate that is held by consensus among most scientists. Because this entire concept of non-locality is based on the assumption that there exists a spatially extended universe. But that's just an abstract structure, right? All we have is sense data to interpret how we will.
Sure. Look, I was simply, unless my physics is out of date, I was referring to the apparently random events like radioactive decay, where there are spontaneous events that, as I understood, and the theories changed, which you may well have, Einstein's concern with that was that the claim was that it wasn't that we didn't know the cause, the claim was there was no cause. Now, physics may have changed, and that may not be even the consensus anymore, so it has changed. Okay, well, I defer to
In the
you.
1960s, Bell had a series of thought experiments that disproves the paradox that Einstein and his two colleagues put forward about the existence of non-local hidden variables.
Look, I'm okay with all that. We don't have to get into it, partly because of lack of my competence, but it's not relevant to our dispute. I was simply pointing to the fact that everything is up for grabs. And
not everything. First of all, the rules of logic are not...
Logic is not science. Logic is not science.
Science uses the rules of logic. So
It's axiomatic to science.
Yeah, logic is reasoning. That's our rules for reasoning.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
We're not going to disagree about that.
So what is there to science apart from the rules of logic? Is it just
No.
inductive reasoning?
No, you have to distinguish the empirical claims from the... And in fact, there's a dispute about whether logic could be different. If you look at the literature, there are claims that two-valued logic is not the only logic. These are subtle, very complicated things. The disagreement between us doesn't have to get into all this. I was just disputing the claim that there are certain things that are somehow axiomatic or not open to revision. That's just whether we may not even disagree about that. So we don't have to get too far into the physics.
generally humans have like, Uthman was touching on it. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Uthman was touching on the fitra and natural inclination. Generally we see that humans have a natural inclination towards something higher. How do you read and interpret human beings in terms of these natural aspirations?
Look, I said something relevant to that. Let me repeat it a little bit. We have lots of natural inclinations. In other words, from biology we know much of what we do and think is based on innate predispositions, genetically determined. In fact, one of my main areas of research and interest is language. I happen to share Chomsky's view of generative linguistics and the idea that much of language actually, surprisingly, is not learned. It's genetically determined as a species-specific property of human beings. There's a lot of innate things. Some people are arguing that many of our moral values, in fact, are like that. There's a whole literature on the source of our moral sentiments, our innate tendencies. Clearly we have many. Okay, so we may even have a tendency to believe transcendent things. This is a claim about what our innate capacities are. That's fundamentally an empirical claim about human nature. That's a scientific claim about how we are. Animals have different innate abilities from us. Okay, so that's a claim about our psychology. The fact that we may have an innate belief in something doesn't make it true. In fact, we do have lots of innate beliefs which turn out to be wrong because they're contrary to our instincts or our common sense. So nothing follows from the fact of innate, but I did mention that insofar as we have other inclinations to behave in certain ways, many of those we regard as not virtuous. In fact, we organise things to control our innate propensities. So these are questions which can be given plausible answers.
So, the fitra you mentioned in your presentation, do you think that this can be just something that we have made up? There is actually no such thing?
I think the important question when it comes to any human nature, natural human inclination, disposition, is how we should treat it. And Peter makes a good point. He says, well, whatever it is, if it's there, it doesn't really oblige us. It doesn't, nothing logically sort of follows in terms of you have to do it this or that way. For me, I think, and this is probably generally the inclination in the Islamic tradition, is to give the natural disposition a much more important role. And I think that's because there are certain things about the human being that make them human, which you cannot escape. You can't sort of go and do sort of this Cartesian, go onto the separate plane thing. So it's much more in a, in fact, around the 20th century, more of a Heideggerian the tradition where you're thrown into the world, this is the world you're in. And so even when you engage in empirical investigation, you do it in a human way, right? And so things like the rules of logic and morality, I think these things are given, and it's not that they logically oblige something, but that you can't do without them. And so they become like a basic belief, a pre-scientific commitment, and you look for what accords with it or does not accord with it, right? And I think that's how most people behave. I said I started with the example of not just murder, but a very specific case of murder, which everyone would agree is wrong. And I think it's a very, not just interesting, but very important observation to say, well, why does everyone do that? Clearly there's something objectively human about that inclination. But it's never going to be sufficient. In the Islamic tradition, it's not sufficient that it's an inclination. That's why revelation, everything is there. But it becomes a criteria, and this is the point. No empirical or philosophical or any other inquiry can be done in some sort of absolute vacuum, even a quantum one. You can't do it, right? And so there has to be some grounds. And so the fitra becomes, or the naturalism becomes like a ground through which human inquiry is made.
I want to take it to one other big topic is we've seen the rise of practices such as mindfulness, yoga, these sort of things, meditation and the like rising in society. This seems to echo much of what religion used to do and what it tries to do to people and give people some comforts. Do many seem to try and fill a gaping hole that religion used to provide?
Look, I think I feel that gaping hole. I just can't fill it the way you might be able to. That's one of the dilemmas of atheism. Bertrand Russell did write about this in an essay. I'm often quoting the slight shock or the cold or the apparent, even perhaps depressing picture that atheism provides. There's no question about that. And people have needs that maybe atheism doesn't quite fulfill. I think I share that. In a way, I'm kind of envious of people that can be comfortable in beliefs that I happen to think are not true. That's just a reality of psychology. I can admit that, I think. But so, yes, I mean, look, I don't do yoga. I find other things that give that kind of perhaps satisfaction. I play a musical instrument, I listen to music. Look, these are things that satisfy certain needs and provide some psychological comforts or attitudes. There are all sorts of things. You can play sport, there's all sorts of things you can do. So the fact that they have a religious flavour in some cultures, well, I happen not to be sympathetic to that, but that's fine for other people. I mean, I don't know what else to say about that. In some cultures, yoga is a spiritual exercise. I mean, a lot of people do it just to be fit or something, and they get into some state. To be honest, I'd get bored if I meditated, so it doesn't work for me. But that doesn't mean it's not good for other people, and I'm not critical of that at all.
I think generally, probably not a very significant point, but I think it is the case where, as I said, the secularism thesis, which was a social scientific thesis, thought that with modernisation, with rationalisation, with industrialisation, the purpose of religion fades away. And there were different theories, that religion provides a glue, but now you have other things, that religion, provides certain meaning. I know we have rationalisation, but I think what's happened, by and large, is that you've either got alternative spiritualities, or you've got a persistence of your old school religion, although in some varied forms in some cases. And again, I think that speaks to the fact that there is a very strong, innate, human disposition that needs to be taken more seriously, I think, in the sense that I spoke about earlier.
I agree with that too.
Perhaps more on the descriptive side, like just sort of taking heed of what's been happening in society recently. Like obviously, Australia is largely secular, and just the West generally. So, like over time, we've seen society change quite significantly in terms of like key values that society used to have. So, for example, arguably like the family used to be a lot more important, but now it's not. Arguably, like a lot of different, like a lot of developments that have to do with like, a lot of new health problems, a lot of mental health issues and that sort of thing. Now, a lot of religious people say that these problems in society exist because of the absence of religion, but at the same time, you have atheists who say a lot of problems, not necessarily the ones outstanding, but a lot of problems come because sort of the irrationality that religion sometimes brings to the table, the hostility and sort of the backbone, so to speak. So I suppose the question is, looking at sort of the past few decades and how societies are changing, what insight can we draw about what religion contributes to society, what values it keeps in it, what sort of where makes society go wrong, so to speak?
Look, it's a nice question, and it makes me think of something to say that I may not have said. Look, I'm very proud to say I've got many friends that are deeply religious people, and I admire them enormously. I love these friends. They're the most decent people I know. And we happen not to agree about the theological things, but there's no question that religion gives people values and encourages them, for whatever reason, to live a decent life. And on the other hand, you can certainly find, and I think in the world, it's the non-believers, like these atheists that I'm very cross about. I think they're some of the most disgraceful human beings on the planet. I've written about this, by the way, if you're interested. I've written an article about those atheists and why, in the name of atheism, they actually have a religion too. It's a religion of state worship. They worship the state uncritically, and so that's the politics of it. So I think you're right, and the people that I admire most, I actually find, it's a personal judgment. I often say it like this. I find if people believe in God or something for which I think there's not much evidence, I don't find that either intellectually or morally as bad as people who believe things contrary to overwhelming evidence they know about. That's a lot of atheists who believe certain kinds of political and other kinds of nonsense. This is not the place for me to go into my politics. But morally and emotionally and intellectually, I find those disgraceful human beings And it's got nothing to do with whether they believe in God. As it happens, I think religion does fulfill an important moral function in many people's lives. And maybe the world would be better off if there was more of it. So it goes back to the question of secularisation. I'm not sure secularisation has been a good thing. It's just, at the intellectual level, inevitably, Bertrand Russell was once asked, if you go, you know, the great atheist philosopher, somebody asked him once, what's going to happen when you get to heaven and you see God? What are you going to say then? And he said, look, I'm sorry, God, there just wasn't enough evidence, I'm sorry. So in other words, with the best intentions in the world, an atheist might just not be able to come around to the conviction, but that doesn't mean that you can't be sympathetic and have who are prominent Anglican bishop and some rabbis. And I love these people. I think they're the most decent human beings in the world. Now, we disagree about things which I think actually in a funny sort of way are less important than the things we agree about. So it's an interesting question. Yeah.
I think it's probably a question beyond the scope of the discussion, not in a way that I want to say it's inadmissible, but that it needs a lot more time. I think you mentioned arguments from both sides. I think they're probably a bit rash arguments that are not really looking at the problematic closely enough. So it's, for instance, this idea that because there's more mental health issues, that somehow that's because of an absence of religion. Or Islam, let me speak for Islam. Islam never intended to set up a utopia on the earth where there's no problems, right? So in part of life is meant to be social collective life, and personal life is meant to be better, but there is suffering. We just spoke about there's suffering, there's trials, there's tribulations, and a big part of the test is a person's sincerity and the loving servitude of God. It's not a utilitarian game of, you know, what gains do I get, how excellent the society becomes. So in other words, the point is, there is always going to be problems. So they can't automatically be seen as a result of the absence of religion. And likewise on the other side, obviously there's atheist arguments about religion and violence and irrationality. They're probably inadmissible because they don't really make much logical sense. But it's a bigger discussion that I don't think it really plays to the details of our topic.
Hi, I'm Jay. I'm an atheist, but I agree with Uthman in many ways.
All right, well, repeat after me.
I believe in the first part of the Shahada that there is no God. But I started off as a Marxist, and then I eventually realised that Marxism has a lot of similarities with religion. And I agree to the extent that science can tell you the way the world is. It's very descriptive, but it doesn't give you any kind of normative framework about how society should run. So the question that I have, and this is the one that I messaged you, and I'll just read it out. All civilizations were built on martyrdom by conquering armies comprised of people willing to die for a more just society, which can only be achieved through inspiration. Arguably, religion performs this function exceedingly well, because in the words of Christ, man cannot live on bread alone. And therefore, isn't the effectiveness of God as a rhetorical device invoked by political actors enough to believe in God?
The last part again, isn't
the effectiveness of God as a rhetorical device invoked by political actors enough to believe in God? That is, even if God didn't exist, it would be important to invent him because that's how you build civilization.
Probably, and that people do that. Certain politicians definitely do that, and in the long tradition. Whether they're theists, whether they actually believe or not, obviously the concept of God and what it brings has been mobilized for all sorts of ends, which just proves that it's very powerful, right? And I think it shows that there is some very strong innate connection, otherwise it wouldn't work, and you stop doing that for a while. So I think it can be done, it is done, but I'm not sure what that would...
It works better if you actually believe in God. That's
right. Okay, that's fine, but it's an instrumental argument.
Yeah.
If I could just jump in there, I'm not even sure that's true. Look, you suggested perhaps that a lot of these conflicts historically are based on beliefs in God, or at least the leaders, promoting it. Nowadays, at least, that's just not true. That's why I point to the atheists that I'm angry about, who are, I think, culpable and complicit in a lot of the terrible things going on in the world today. And it's not on the basis of religion. If you look at the seriously big conflicts in the world today, we could enumerate them, they're not about religion. They're about greed, about territory. It's not the place to go into the Middle East, but some of you may know I have a deep engagement in Middle East conflict. people often think, and in fact these atheists that I'm very cross about, they say something which is outrageous. One of them, Sam Harris or Hitchens or one of these guys, says it's about the religious leaders on both sides, fighting with each other. A high school kid knows that's not what the Israel-Palestine conflict is about. So these are the smart guys, the serious, intelligent, well-educated, objective, rational scientists, intellectuals, and they talk shit, to put it politely. Well, what can you say about that? It's not about that, it's about all sorts of other political stuff going on. So I don't blame religion, at least of all Islam, as they want to blame it. So.
So I would just like to reflect on the thing of secularism that you said, because I think this idea of secularism is it's a cultural supremacy and ideological supremacy to the to the East as well as Middle Eastern country. Because if you look at obviously how secularism started, because in the West, in England, in other countries, where the king needed the validation from the church that this is the nominated ruler of God. So that's how it actually played out. So church needed the validity of the king, support, and king needed the validity of church in order to exist. And then when it had to be separated, that's when the idea of secularism came. So that's the Western cultural problem. But in the East, for example, if you go to India, there was a never issue of that, a ruler needed a validity from the mosque or whatever. So, and then in that sense, East was always ahead of them. And then we are secular, in the literal sense of what later came to be. And so, but then, so this idea of secularism, this is not a necessity that the East or the other parts of the culture ever needed. So it's particularly Western, but because of the media and other things, now that Western, everything has to be kind of exported to everyone, and it's the it's the only thing that should be followed anyway. So I just wanted to, add to that secularism debate, because in the East or in the Middle East, we never needed secularism because we never had this idea of, validation by church to rule the society. And that's where the secularism actually came from. And I think a lot of secularists even don't know this to begin with. And they say I'm a secular, but they don't know what actually secularism is or how it started historically. And my question is, if the science, logic, rationality, thinking is the basis of, forming one's worldview. So if I may ask, Professor, are you an atheist?
Yes.
But then why are you an atheist? Because I think that's unscientific, irrational, or I would say, because I'm a student of physics, I was, but now I'm a computer science. And so I had a few things in my life. So I was a very practicing Muslim when I was very young, teenager. Then I became kind of, atheist, and then I became kind of a believer, not a practicing one again. And then, I became atheist again. And then I studied physics deeply, and I said that I think atheism is unscientific. It's just, if you think that religion doesn't make sense, atheism doesn't. Because we only know about the, 96% of the, I'll just cut short, 90% of the world is dark matter, and only 4% of that we know. And even that info, that totally, we don't know. So it's kind of the realm of science, and then within this tiny thing, we know you are just using that, diminishing God. And then I became from agnostic, which is more sensible, and then I became atheist. So why are you an atheist? My question is that if science is the basis of forming one's worldview.
I don't know if you want to answer, but that's beyond the
scope
of the discussion today.
Well, sort of, yeah. I've sort of answered it already.
Okay.
So you can talk afterwards. Put him on the spot.
Yeah.
Ask for the evidence.
So I think Professor agrees with me. He doesn't have anything to say further after. Anyway, yeah.
So I just have a question to Peter. So if there's no religion, then I'm assuming people come to a common understanding that through a social contract, which Thomas Hobbes touched upon and provides. But as he pointed out, this social contract houses different interests. The existence of petro wars and the crimes against humanity that follow. So how do we come to this solution whereby everyone has the same interests and everyone kind of just lives in harmony in that sense?
It's a tough question. I don't know the answer. I don't think Hobbes is the last word on this, but I indicated that as a question about human nature, which has some merit, that we're not all good, and cooperating is rational, and there are reasons. By the way, the notion of a social contract wasn't meant literally, it was kind of a metaphor for how we get on implicitly. In this room, we have a contract to behave in certain ways, and because we all have an interest in it. And it's a nice idea, and there were many social contract theorists. It's not my specialty, but... so your question was, what was the question again? How our interests all conflict with one another? Well, they do. And the point of living harmoniously together is to find ways to reconcile them, and we all try. It's part of what living together requires, in fact, if it's to work. But that's why you end up having a police, and you have all sorts of forms of social control if they don't get out of hand.
But wouldn't you assume that you need like one like solid text that everyone just kind of agrees upon?
A text.
Yeah, a text or like a writing law that just everyone agrees upon, and like the interest.
But that's totalitarianism. The problem with that is you don't want to impose... I mean, we have a society... Some people are anarchists. I mean, I'm rather sympathetic to the idea there shouldn't be an overriding authority. People ought to be freer to act in certain ways without an overriding authority. I mean, I'm not a political scientist and I couldn't give you a proper account of that, but people like Chomsky argue that anarchism is the right view, meaning, in a technical sense, authority that's not justifiable ought not to be imposed on us. And we have lots of authorities that are imposing on us, including our own governments and the university I work for and a few other places where often authority is unjustifiable. Okay, so there has to be some balance there. But the idea of a text that we should all share is asking too much, because clearly we have different views. And going back to secularism, one of the virtues of, let's say, our secular society is that it separates church and state for, I think, good reasons, because we may not agree, but we can get on fine if you're free to practice your religion and believe in a text, but it's not official and it's not imposed on anybody else. And I think that's not a bad solution, that we can differ about things, but we have a society where, in a sense, all of the differences are treated equally, in the sense that none of them are imposed on anybody else. Now, I like that. I may not agree with you, but I don't have to impose my particular preferred text onto you. That's not a bad solution. Now, I don't know whether, if you happen to have a commitment, let's say you're Muslim or anybody else, maybe some groups, I think they do, want to impose their particular way of life and their values on others. I don't think that's a good solution. I think it's problematic. Unless that's an answer.
Please. It's obviously an important discussion. Secularism and so we're tying it together. Secularism is actually my area of doctoral specialization. The way you sort of describe secularism as a separate church state, and my position is the popular. It's what popularly understood, but it's not a very accurate characterization of secularism. To the extent, and I think that's within what you already said at the start, in terms of anarchism, you cannot have a society without any imposition. Otherwise, let me rephrase that, with the exception of an anarchist society, right, which probably wouldn't work. Most people would say anyway, it wouldn't work with anarchy. Surprise, surprise. But if you're going to have any form of government, the government's going to have some normative vision.
Within bounds.
Within bounds to make a difference, but it's going to be of a particular ideological bent. So for instance, usually, not that secularism is tied to liberalism, but usually in our modern Western democratic society, it's secular liberalism. We have some form of liberalism that is imposed, right? It's imposed because there's a law, there's a police force, and there's certain things that certain religions may allow but are disallowed because liberalism deems them to be pre-modern or backward or whatever, right? Whether Christian or Islamic or otherwise. So there is imposition. You can't have a state without imposition. So the point is, therefore, secularism sounds nice on paper because it's misconstrued as allowing for this neutral space where everyone can do what they want and believe what they want. But it's not that. It's a particular form of imposition. And I think if we recognize that, then we can discuss different types of imposition in a more honest way. So, okay, there's going to have to be imposition, living inside the anarchist option. How are these forms of imposition different? But when you sort of say, oh, no, this is neutral, you can do what you want, then obviously it's convenient, but it's not actually, it's obviously necessarily not the case.
Did you mean liberalism, like a certain conception of freedom that is left to a secular state? Because you sounded like imposing freedom is some kind of imposition.
Yeah, but it's not just freedom.
Well,
There are,
within-
there are,
There are some things where the freedom has to be constrained and limited.
That's right, but within how you decide that is from some moral framework. You have to. Right? And so even a secular moral framework is still a moral framework. So for instance, your concrete example, some religious traditions like Islam allow for polygamy. Not that whether you or I agree with this or disagree with this, right? But polygamy, what I mean by polygamy in the Islamic tradition is an organised, structured, rights and responsibilities, so on and so forth. In many liberal secular states, it's disallowed. Because there's a certain understanding, right? So there's a moral judgment, and so therefore there's an imposition, right? And my point is just you can't do without that. You can't have a society and go, guys, do whatever you want. Tell me when you're, nothing to do. It doesn't work. There has to be, your economic policy has to have some normative basis. Your political policy, your foreign policy has to have that. So there has to be imposition, and therefore a more honest debate is about how is liberal imposition different to an Islamic or a Christian or a Marxist imposition. That's a more honest debate. But what secular liberalism does is this sort of sleight of hand, make yourself neutral, both politically and epistemologically, when secular reason is this sort of free-flowing, neutral reason. But religious reason and others appeal to these texts. Everyone appeals to some framework. You have to. So I think that makes for a more honest debate.
So we're not going to be taking any more questions. Just a 2-minute closing remark from either speaker.
Uthman, go ahead.
2 minutes. I already have 3 minutes just there. Just I guess to reiterate or summarise the points that I made, I think in the end this is about a inquiry, an investigation into a larger question. What is the reality of the world around us? Everyone engages in that, whether explicitly or implicitly. Some people do it. Some people don't engage in it systematically. So you just go through life, inheriting whatever you inherited from your parents. Most people perhaps do that, but I think we could agree that there is a need to reflect on these matters to some extent. And really, the Islamic tradition, that's what it calls for. And really, in the end, what God is looking for is sincerity and diligence, which would, in our understanding, lead you to the truth. And my argument tonight has been that 2 explanations of the world around us, 2 narratives of the world, because you can't just have, it's not just about does God exist or not, that's necessarily part of the broader framework that answers questions of politics and ethics and cosmology and ontology and other fancy words, right? But basically asking what is the reality of the world around us, where does it come from, what is it made of, what exists, what doesn't exist, and so on and so forth. What's our moral compass in life? We have 2 frameworks. When you look at any framework, you're looking for coherence and substantiation. My argument tonight was that the atheist narrative does not pass the first test. It's not coherent. You can't say, science is the only means of truth, and then assert all these other propositions that you cannot substantiate scientifically. And likewise, the point about morality and purpose, subjective, instrumental. If you, again, follow the evidence, and then the evidence with no purpose,